This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Atelia Edwards. Tonight's top stories. Gulf energy assets firmly in the crosshairs of the Mideast conflict, raising fears of a prolonged war and deeper supply crunch. Brent crude jumps to $118 a barrel, and European gas surges up to 35%. Now, US President Donald Trump warns Tehran hit Qatar's LNG again, and Iran's South Pars gas field goes up in smoke. Washington says it had no role in the Israeli strike that sparked Tehran's retaliation. Well, the conflict's casting a shadow over Mr. Trump's meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. Iran, trade and China are expected to lead the agenda in talks set to happen just a few hours from now. And turning to Hong Kong, public hearings into the deadly Tai Po fire begin, revealing failures in nearly all the life-saving measures used in the blaze that killed almost 170 people. Well, escalating attacks on Persian Gulf energy infrastructure are pushing the war on Iran into a dangerous new phase, and with threats of more strikes ahead. And for more, let's turn to Olivia now about the markets. Are the markets bracing for prolonged supply shocks?
That's right, Oteli, with tensions rising and also no sign in sight for the Strait of Hormuz reopening, traders are practically pricing in sustained Iranian attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure, worsening a supply crunch that's already removed millions of barrels of oil from global markets and keeps driving energy prices higher. They shot up again today after Iran attacked several Gulf energy facilities and warned of more in retaliation for a strike on one of its key gas fields, exacerbating fears of a global supply crunch. Brent crude hit $118 a barrel, while European gas prices surged 30% to their highest since the conflict began. U.S. heating oil futures, the benchmark for diesel and jet fuel, hit their highest since October 2022, surging by more than 50% since the start of war, raising costs for airlines, trucking, and heavy industry. That's despite President Trump's attempt to prevent a further escalation in strikes. Mr. Trump earlier warned that the U.S. would blow up Iran's South Pars gas field if Iran carried out further attacks on the energy assets in Qatar. Iran's Revolutionary Guards say that energy sites in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are now legitimate targets after Israel's strike on South Pars. Operators have begun evacuating listed sites and other facilities as a precaution, Gulf oil officials said.
Well, Qatar has ordered Iranian security and military attachés to leave the country after Tehran's missiles hit the main gas facility of Ras Laffan. Other facilities and refineries across the Gulf were also struck. Now, Fiona Nicole-Mee is covering this story for CNA, and she joins us live from Dubai. Fiona, Iran's continuing to ramp up its attacks across the Gulf. What is the latest on that front?
Yes, the attacks came hours after Iran threatened to attack oil and gas facilities across the Gulf region in retaliation for an Israeli attack on its South Pars gas field. As you mentioned, we have more information from the earlier drone attack in Kuwait. The fire force there said some time ago, 6 teams were battling simultaneous fires at Mina al-Amadi and Mina Abdullah refineries, 2 of the country's key energy sites. Here in the UAE, operations were suspended at Abu Dhabi's Habshan gas facility. Authorities there responding to 2 incidents of falling debris from a missile interception. And the Bab oil field, which was also targeted there. The Habshan complex, operated by Abu Dhabi state oil giant ADNOC, is the world's biggest oil processing facility. We also heard from the Minister of Foreign Affairs here saying the attack was a dangerous escalation, a violation of the principles of international law. And the ministry also saying in a statement it refers its full right to take all necessary measures to protect sovereignty and national security, and stressed that targeting of vital energy infrastructure represented a direct threat to regional stability and global energy markets that we've been discussing. Qatari Foreign Affairs Minister reported extensive damage to the Ras Laffan facility there, and also widespread condemnation. We saw, as you mentioned, Qatar's Ministry of Interior adding no injuries there. Saudi also coming under attack today, and they're warning of escalation if this goes further.
Well, thanks for that report, Fiona Nicole-Me, covering this story for CNA from Dubai. Now, Singapore's Prime Minister spoke about the war on Iran as he wrapped up a visit to Japan. Lawrence Wong says that his government is monitoring the Middle East conflict closely and stands ready to roll out additional support measures for households and businesses if needed. Mr. Wong warned of a world where international rules and laws continue to be weakened, a significant concern not just for small states, but all nations.
This trend were to continue, then we will end up in a world where there will be more conflicts, where differences will be resolved not in peaceful engagements, but with show of force, with coercive tactics, and it will be a more volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous world. So we worry about this, and that's also why we work very hard to forge coalitions of like-minded countries who feel very strongly about upholding a rules-based order.
Prime Minister Wong also warned of wider risks from the Iran conflict. He says a prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could have severe consequences for the global economy beyond energy.
Because the supply of fertilizer, for example, may be impacted, and then it will have downstream impact on food supply. Or take another, something else like helium. I think 30% of helium comes through, of the world's helium, comes through the Strait of Hormuz. And helium is used in MRI machines, specialized equipment in hospitals. It's used in semiconductor production. So a prolonged blockage of the strait will have significant implications for the global economy and may tip the global economy into a tailspin, into a downturn or even a recession.
Well, we have more coverage of the war on Iran on our website, cna.asia, as well as our mobile app. And that includes commentaries such as this one about how AI has accelerated the speed and scale of the war. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has arrived in Washington for summit talks with U.S. President Donald Trump. She is the first major American ally to meet him face-to-face since his call for countries, including Japan, to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz. Ms. Takaichi told Parliament yesterday that her government has not received any official request from Washington. She added that Japan is carefully assessing what it can do within the limits of its pacifist constitution. Japan is among one of the U.S. allies that Mr. Trump has repeatedly complained about for rejecting his request to help safeguard the strait. Ms. Takaichi is signaling a cautious approach, acknowledging that talks with Mr. Trump are likely to be tough.
先ほど来申し上げてます通り、日本の法律に従ってできることはできるけど、できないことはできない、それをしっかりとお伝えするつもりですし、先方もこれまでの経緯から日本の法律よくご承知のはずでございます。
For more, CNA's senior correspondent Michio Ishida joins us live from Tokyo. Michio, first up, what are some of the key priorities both leaders will be looking to nail down, especially when it comes to security and energy?
Well, according to Japanese media, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is looking to purchase Alaskan crude oil. Now, this is to diversify from around 95% of procurement of crude oil from the Middle East. Also, there are views in Japan it could be included in the $550 billion investment deal Japan has pledged to Mr. Donald Trump last July. Now, transport of oil from Alaska to Japan will take only 12 days as compared to 20 days from the Middle East. But the downside is Japanese oil refineries are built for Middle East oil. So there is likely to be the need to invest in new refineries. For the $550 billion investment, 3 projects were announced in February worth $36 billion, and they include natural gas power plant, oil export terminal, and synthetic industrial diamond plant. And for the second group of selections, Japanese media expect investment in gas-fired power generation and a next-generation small modular nuclear reactors. Now, separately, investment on rare earth minerals, lithium, copper to strengthen supply chain of important materials are likely to be discussed. On Iran, Ms. Takaichi is expected to condemn attacks on civilians in diplomatic facilities of its neighbors, that she will not tolerate its nuclear program. It says 82% of Japanese public does not support U.S. attack on Iran, according to a recent poll by Asahi Shimbun. Now, as a gesture of friendship, Japan is expected to present 250 cherry trees to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States. The famous cherry blossoms along the Potomac River in Washington is a symbol of friendship dating back to 1912, when then Tokyo mayor presented 3,000 cherry trees. Now here's more on the overall picture of the key issues and concerns Ms. Takaichi is expected to discuss with Mr. Trump.
The first female Prime Minister in the history of Japan.
Ms. Sanae Takaichi has security, trade, and critical technologies high on her Washington agenda. But the Iran war may well dominate the Japanese leaders' talks with U.S. President Donald Trump. 90% of Japan's crude oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and the interruption to that flow of oil could hit home soon. Tokyo says 45 Japanese vessels are stuck in the Persian Gulf with 24 Japanese crew and many other nationalities on board.
It's in our interest that this conflict ends soon, right? The sooner the better, simply for the sake of energy. So I think that's the first message that we want to get across, but in a right way that doesn't disturb Trump.
Japan has oil reserves worth about 250 days or 470 billion barrels, but that too could run out in a prolonged conflict. Japanese media reports say Ms. Takaichi may propose buying crude oil from Alaska.
Diversifying the sources of energy resources has been our objective and a headache for a long, long time, since 1973. There have been many reasons for the Americans not to export oil from Alaska for domestic or environmental reasons. But I think it's time to seriously explore that possibility due to the war in the Gulf.
Mr. Trump has been pressuring U.S. allies to strengthen their defense capabilities, and some are confident Japan has done its part.
We are doing more than 2% now. It was only 1% till a few years ago, so it's totally changing, and Japan's acquiring a second strike capability as well. And so I think we're satisfied with Japan's strong position on defense spending.
Reports also say Ms. Takaichi will convey her intention to join Mr. Trump's Golden Dome missile defense system to counter China.
It's absolutely necessary that we rethink about air defense. That's very clear in this war, that there has been a huge utilization of cheap drones, and the number of Patriots that being collected from all over the world has been immense. We need to rethink how do we protect ourselves from these missiles and drones.
Since Mr. Trump took office in January, the two countries have had frequent tariff negotiations. Last July, Japan agreed to a $550 billion investment in return for a lower tariff rate from 25% to 15%.
As we have already committed, I think we should continue to honor what we have committed.
Ms. Takaichi faces a difficult act in Washington, but analysts are optimistic. since her comment on Taiwan sparked a diplomatic crisis with China. They believe she has learned how to take better control of international affairs.
Now, Michio, I want to pick up on the latest U.S. threat assessment, basically suggesting that Japan's stance on Taiwan marks a, quote, significant shift, and the timing is notable, coming just as Prime Minister Takaichi arrives in Washington. So how is Tokyo responding to that?
Well, that question was asked to Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara, but he refrained from commenting on the U.S. threat assessment document during his regular news conference. He did explain Japan's basic stance in a so-called survival-threatening situation. And this is his comment.
いかなる事態が存立危機事態に該当するかについては、実際に発生した事態の個別具体的な状況に即して政府がすべての情報を総合して判断するという政府の立場は、これは従来から一貫しておりまして、重大な方針転換との指摘は当たらないと考えております。
Well, in Japan, political watchers say Ms. Takaichi was the first to call Taiwan contingency as a survival-threatening situation for Japan. Her predecessors kept their ambiguous stance. Her comments suggested the possibility Japan will exercise collective self-defense with the U.S. in the event. And Beijing demanded she retract her statement. Now, she didn't. And this stance of hers gained public support, partly contributing to her popularity, and it was reflected in her landslide victory in the February snap elections. Many analysts here believe Mr. Trump likes strong leaders. He was openly flagging his support for her during the general election. So analysts think he basically feels good about her and is willing to spend extensive time with her, hosting her both lunch and dinner.
Well, we'll have to see how the talks turn out. Thanks so very much for that report. CNA senior correspondent Michio Ishida reporting to us live from Tokyo. Well, talks between the U.S. and Japanese leaders coming at a critical time, with the war on Iran disrupting key oil routes and raising pressure on allies. Well, later in the bulletin, we'll be speaking to an analyst on how much support Tokyo can realistically offer. All right, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia Tonight, the Bank of Japan keeps interest rates unchanged amid limited progress on inflation and growing downside risks to the economy linked to the Iran conflict. Deep job cuts could be on the table for HSBC as part of a multi-year overhaul driven by artificial intelligence. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia Tonight. And you are just in time for another business update with Olivia Marzuki. So, Liv, I know that you've been on a Japan Central Bank watch today. No surprises from the BOJ?
No, definitely not. I'll tell you, the decision to keep borrowing costs unchanged was largely expected, but the BOJ maintained its bias for tighter monetary policy. It follows the path of at least two other major central banks this week, as policymakers assess the uncertainties created by the Iran war. The policymakers maintain a cautious stance, citing heightened tensions in the Middle East and the resulting impact on oil prices. They said the Japanese economy is likely to continue growing moderately, but acknowledge that rising oil prices are a risk to the outlook. The BOJ last lifted rates to that level in December, marking a 30-year high as part of its gradual policy normalization. But the war-driven oil shock is complicating its next moves. Policymakers face a delicate balancing act from the conflicting pressures. Surging oil prices tied to the Iran conflict are pushing import costs higher and boosting inflation. If the BOJ holds to support growth, the yen could weaken further, which would make it more expensive to import energy. If it hikes to curb inflation and strengthen the yen, it risks stalling Japan's fragile growth. Analysts say that the BOJ has the least policy flexibility among Asian central banks, given that the country relies heavily on the Middle East for 95% of its oil supplies. The persistently weak Japanese yen is already eroding the purchasing power of households and businesses. Speaking of yen, the currency has edged closer to the key level of 160 to the greenback. Stock markets closely watching those currency swings as they may impact companies' bottom lines. The move in Japan's 10-year bond yields also reflecting another complicating factor to the BOJ's decision today. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's policies lean towards subsidies and tax cuts in order to cushion the blow of oil price surge. That has raised concerns on Japan's ability to fund these measures, given a public debt that's roughly 230% of GDP. Iran's latest attacks on the Gulf energy sites worsening the surge in oil prices, amplifying concerns over supply chain disruptions across the chip industry. Materials derived from the Middle Eastern energy markets are used extensively in electronics manufacturing, from printed circuit boards to semiconductor process chemicals. South Korean memory giants SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics fell around 2%. Japan's Advantest fell over 4%. Tokyo Electron sank more than 2%. As we speak now, SK Hynix and Samsung, actually, they close even deeper in the red, 4% for SK Hynix. A deep sell-off also seen in China's AI names, a 14% plunge for Minimax, 11% slump for Knowledge Atlas Technology, also known as Tai Po AI. HSBC is weighing deep job cuts as part of a multi-year overhaul driven by AI. Bloomberg reports that the bank could ultimately cut around 20,000 roles. That's roughly 10% of its global workforce, although the review is still at an early stage. Non-client-facing roles, especially in global services centers, are expected to be most affected as HSBC ramps up AI adoption to streamline operations and reduce costs. The lender employed more than 208,000 staff at the end of 2025. The potential layoffs are a part of a medium-term plan spanning 3 to 5 years. That plan could include not replacing departing staff, as well as cuts tied to business exits or sales. The move comes as CEO Jorge El-Hedari pushes to simplify the bank, cut costs, and focus on higher value businesses. No final decisions have been made as of now. Alibaba registered a sharp slide in profitability with prolonged property crisis and weak consumer sentiment weighing on China's e-commerce giant. The firms delivered a 3% increase in revenue during the October to December quarter in 2025 compared to the year-ago period, but its net profit plummeted 66% on year to just $40 billion. Heavy spending on one-hour delivery and promotions during the peak shopping season failed to create a surge in demand. Alibaba continues to face stiff competition from rivals JD.com and Meituan, pressuring their profit margins. Alibaba shares sliding sharply on Wall Street in pre-market trading about 4% underwater. Oil rally fueled by the Iran war is complicating the Fed's path forward. The U.S. Central Bank paused rates at the level where they have been since December. They acknowledge that higher energy prices could delay any move towards easing. But Fed Chair Jerome Powell said it's too soon to know for sure how the energy shock will play out.
The thing I really want to emphasize is that nobody knows. The economics effect could be bigger, they could be smaller, they could be much smaller or much bigger. We just don't know. So people are writing down something that seems to make sense to them but have no conviction.
But progress on U.S. inflation is looking increasingly challenging. Fed officials lifted their 2026 inflation forecast to 2.7% from 2.4%. Latest projections also point to 1 quarter-point cut by the end of this year, unchanged from its December outlook. And that's all I have for business, Ateli. It's back to you.
Thanks so very much for that, Olivia.
Well, on that note, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, talks between a US and Japanese leader coming at a critical time with the war on Iran disrupting key oil routes and raising pressure on allies. We'll speak to an analyst more on what we can expect during these talks. And Singapore's Prime Minister concludes his visit to Japan, saying Tokyo can play a bigger regional role if it resolves historical issues with countries. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Gulf energy assets firmly in the crosshairs of the Mideast conflict, raising fears of a prolonged war and deeper supply crunch. Brent crude jumps to $118 a barrel, and European gas surges up to 35%. US President Donald Trump warns Tehran, hit Qatar's LNG again, and Iran's South Pass gas field goes up in smoke. Washington says it had no role in the Israeli strike that sparked Tehran's retaliation. With the conflict casting a shadow over Mr. Trump's meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, Iran, trade and China expected to lead the agenda in talks set to happen just a few hours from now. And for more insights on that high-stakes summit, we are joined now by Kazuto Suzuki, Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo. Well, thanks, Prof, for joining us this evening. Well, let's just start with the tone going into this meeting. By publicly stating what we can and cannot do, how is Prime Minister Takaichi's decision to publicly spell out Japan's limits shaping this tone and shaping her leverage going to the meeting with President Trump?
Well, she's going to be quite explicit that what she can do and what Japan can do and what Japan cannot do. Because of the constitutional constraints, the Japanese self-defense force ships are not able to send to the Persian Gulf. And especially in this case, the United States is the party of concern. It is engaged in a war with Iran. So operating together with the United States will be make the Japanese ships as a target, and I think that will be unacceptable politically as well as legally. So I think there's no way that we can support the Mr. Trump's demand, and I think we may find some other means to support the U.S. actions.
And I wanted you to elaborate on that, Professor, because if military options are limited, and what then is do we see a model where Tokyo perhaps could try and compensate through investment or energy deals? And how sustainable is that?
Well, basically, we don't have the energy deal because we are heavily dependent on the oil from Middle East. I think what we can do as a leverage is that, the historical friendly relationship between Japan and Iran. Japan can be a very good mediator for the peace, and Mr. Trump, who is probably, who seems to be confused with the objective of the war, and I think Mr. Trump is seeking for the exit. And I think Ms. Takaichi will be able to provide the off-ramp for Mr. Trump, and, she needs to deliver that diplomatically, but I think she can offer some Japanese advantages of mediating between Iran and the United States, or to a certain extent to negotiate with the Iranian counterparts to make sure that there will be a safe passage of the through the Strait of Hormuz.
So if that doesn't happen quite so successfully, then how do you think this meeting could then expose, the deeper differences between what Washington wants, their expectations of its allies, and also Tokyo's priorities?
Well, of course, this is somewhat very difficult, the negotiation with Mr. Trump. But I think there are lots of other agendas that needs to be discussed between Japan and the United States, especially with regard to the economic security front. Mr. Trump has been has been, well, the meeting with Mr. Xi Jinping has postponed, but nevertheless, I think one way or another, United States has to negotiate with China, and the key question is that how to build up the the U.S. resilience against the Chinese economic coercion. So Japan can do a lot to support the U.S. industry, and we do have the a reserve in the deep sea in Minami Torishima. There are several issues needs to be discussed in terms of the economic security, and Mr. Takaichi is definitely bringing that as an agenda apart from the issue in the Middle East.
So I want to delve a little bit deeper into the China factor. How do you see, I mean, in what ways China, sort of like the unspoken variable here, going to shape Japan's response into the Hormuz crisis, and also Beijing, while they're reading into all of this, how are they interpreting Japan's current positioning, you think?
Well, the Beijing itself is focusing very much on its own survival and its own benefit of having a good relationship with Iran and the safe passage of the Chinese ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, the China is not trying to use this as an advantage against Japan, even though there is a political spat between Japan and China. Economically, there are much less harm that is planned by China. So, which means that China still wants to have the economic relationship with Japan, and I think Mr. Xi Jinping is not trying to take this as an advantage of pushing Japan into a corner. I think the question of the Persian Gulf is basically it's a global issue rather than the bilateral issue.
All right, so we keep saying about this is a high-stakes summit, right? So looking at the stakes here, Professor, what would a best and worst-case scenario from this meeting look like?
Well, the worst-case scenario is that Mr. Trump is so upset that Japan is not participating in protecting and escorting the tankers through Strait of Hormuz, and this may collapse. But I don't think that's going to happen because the United States needs Japan as the basis for the deterrence capabilities against China, and China factors plays very well in this context. So I think Mr. Trump, no matter how angry he is about Japanese denial to participate in the protection of the tankers, I think there are more serious issues for the United States to deal with China, and the United States needs Japan. So I think the best scenario is that Japan and the United States are working together, with the $550 billion that Japan pledged to invest in the United States to build up the economic security resilience in the United States, and also trying to get sort of a joint development program of the rare earth mineral in the coast of the Minami Torishima, the remote island of Japan.
And I will certainly be watching closely to see whether this meeting narrows the gap happening in a few hours' time. I will always appreciate your insights. Thanks so very much for your time and thoughts. Kazuto Suzuki, Professor of Science and Technology
Thank you for having me.
At the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo. Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says that Japan can take on a bigger role in the region if it's able to put lingering historical issues to rest with other countries. While wrapping up his first official visit to Tokyo, PM Wong says that could lead to greater cooperation, including on regional security. He adds that Singapore's approach is not to be trapped by its past with Japan, but to work with like-minded partners in its national interest. CNA's Sherilyn Seah reports from Tokyo.
As Singapore marks 6 decades of diplomatic ties with Japan, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says the long-standing relationship is mutually beneficial, with cooperation set to grow in areas like technology and cybersecurity, with the upgrade of ties to a strategic partnership. He adds that Singapore has worked closely with Japan over the years as it builds partnerships to strengthen its position in the region.
And Singapore's approach is to build a more secure nation with as many strong and reliable friends as possible. and Japan is one of these friends. Of course, not all countries in the region feel the same way. Some have a different historical perspective, and they feel that some of these historical issues have not been resolved. Singapore's position is we hope Japan can more clearly articulate its position on these issues and put to rest these outstanding historical issues. Doing so, we believe, will enable Japan to play a larger role in regional affairs and to be more active on regional security matters.
In his meetings with Japanese counterpart Sanae Takaichi, discussions covered security cooperation, including such differing perspectives on history. Building trust and confidence, he adds, is an ongoing process and progresses at different pace across countries. When asked about ongoing tensions between China and Japan, PM Wong expresses that Singapore does not take sides. He adds that China is aware of his trip to Japan and has still invited him to make a keynote address at the upcoming Boao Forum for Asia.
Having good relations with one doesn't come at the expense of another. We can be friends with both China and Japan and America for that matter. We want to maintain as many good friends as possible. As far as a small country is concerned, it is helpful to have maximum strategic space for us to operate, and that means cultivating and maintaining good relations with as many powers as possible as we can.
He underscores that Singapore's approach has always been to find common ground and advance cooperation for mutual benefit. That includes areas like energy, one of the key pillars in the strategic partnership with Japan, as both sides are major LNG users. He also points to broader ASEAN-Japan ties as part of a wider effort to strengthen regional cooperation.
Our approach in Singapore is to have an open and inclusive regional architecture with ASEAN at the center, while we in ASEAN engage with all the major powers. Japan is clearly one of them, but there will be others. Whether it's China, Korea, America, India, Europe, we want all of these powers to be actively engaged and present in ASEAN, to have stakes in ASEAN, because we believe that makes for a stabler and more inclusive architecture that will maximize our chances for peace and shared prosperity.
PM Wong also answered questions on the recent changes in Japanese leadership. He says initiatives and projects between Singapore and Japan will continue, even as leadership changes over time. That's because the partnership is anchored in a clear strategic perspective and shared understanding of the mutual benefits of working together. So regardless of who is in charge, PM Wong expects cooperation between both countries to remain steady. Shalin Xia, CNA, Tokyo.
Coming up on East Asia Tonight, public hearings into November's deadly Hong Kong blaze begin today. Human error at the center, with multiple failures revealed. The US and South Korea wrap up their annual springtime drills aimed at strengthening readiness and military cooperation across all domains. The first in a series of public hearings into last November's Hong Kong fire, which claimed 168 lives, has now concluded. Investigators say human error was largely behind the cause of the deadly blaze, as they identify 6 key failures. 38 involved parties are providing evidence to an independent committee. Over 8 hearings in the next 2 weeks. Well, the list includes members of the former management committee of the apartment complex, as well as homeowners and directors of firms behind the renovation project at the time of the tragedy. Now, the city's leader, John Lee, established the investigation body to look into the cause of the inferno and review systemic issues related to building maintenance works. Investigations are still ongoing. And for more on the hearings, CNA's Deborah Wong joins us live from Hong Kong. Deborah, what were some of the key findings on day 1 of the hearing?
One of the key purposes of the independent committee was to uncover the origin of the fire. So we heard in the hearing today that they came quite close to it, but they can't, confirm that this really happened. There was no direct evidence, but councillors said that they found circumstantial evidence that the cause of the fire was due to cigarette butts. What they found was cigarette butts, many of them discarded, in fact, alongside rubbish at this light well at Wanxiong House where the fire was thought to have started. And there was also footage of construction workers that, attendees saw during the hearing, footage of construction workers smoking at various parts of the apartment complex. And this corroborates complaints that residents had given throughout the entire renovation process. Now, the committee went through 4,000 photos and video evidence over the course of the last 3 months, and they also took hundreds of statements from witnesses, including residents, contractors, firefighters, as well as policemen. And, they were trying to just piece together what events unfolded during the day of the fire. So we were shown CCTV footage of close calls. For the very first time, we did see residents making their escape through stairwells, corridors, and even main entrances before smoke completely engulfed the scene within minutes. And we also did see footage of residents trying and failing to get fire alarms to work. They also tried and failed to get a fire hose to work, and we also listened to audio recordings of emergency calls. And it was quite harrowing because at one point there was a caller saying that he's experiencing difficulties breathing. And for the very first time, we did see final footage of firefighter Ho Wai Ho, who eventually died in the fire. Now, the committee heard that Mr. Ho, he attempted to break a window and escape, and he fell to his death. His body was eventually found with multiple burns and fractures as well. So obviously, it's a very traumatic, emotional day for many of the residents. I did watch out for the expressions, and a lot of them just appeared quite emotional. They were shaking their heads when footage of the fire was replaying throughout the hearing. And we did speak to some of them. Let's have a listen.
成個屋苑唔響喎，成個消防鐘係唔響喎，冇理由嘅事嚟㗎嘛，係咪先？有冇啲朋友因為今次大火有啊，我有個親戚走咗啦，咁所以都係心情都唔係好㗎啦。不過就即係叫做話走啊要走㗎啦，人要向前行係嘛，冇得話成日都韞住喺個框框裡面㗎嘛。係有幫助了解清楚啲嗰個即係火警嘅起因啊，同埋個過程啊，同埋啲人都係啲傷心事啦。即係我哋唔止2次傷害，幾次傷害，而家安置係更加傷害。
So the fact that this was traumatizing was not lost on the legal counsel, who repeated several times during the hearing that he was sorry that, residents had to go through this again. He acknowledged that it was heartbreaking and traumatizing, but he called on them to be brave because it was necessary for investigators to sift through all these evidence in order to get to the root of the issue.
So, Deborah, the independent committee was tasked to uncover systemic lapses. I believe they identified 6 key failures, for instance. Were any of these raised?
Absolutely. There was, in fact, the most serious lapse we saw here was that contractors knew about the use of non-fire retardant scaffolding nets, which contributed to the rapid spread of the blaze. But, they continued using them anyway. In fact, there was one quite explicit evidence that, we heard during the committee hearings. There was a recorded phone call during the fire, when the fire broke out. So the caller actually said that, Wang Fu Court is on fire and that the nets used were not fire retardant. So the minute that audio recording was played, there was an audible gasp from the audience, and that was quite clearly a damning piece of evidence. There also seemed to be attempts to cover it up. There were, allegations of what appeared to be falsified certificates. The council also found that inspectors had given contractors advance notice for inspection, and they called it a worrying practice because that could have given them enough time to cover up non-compliant issues. Now, what was also worrying that investigators found was that there were 3 government bodies involved: the Labour Department, Building Department, as well as an independent checking unit. All 3 of them had, different positions on what constituted their scope of duties, especially in addressing complaints from residents about contractors who were smoking. And investigators called this worrying because that meant that no one was following up on these complaints. Now, all these would eventually go into the final report, but it's also important to know that the committee, has no judicial power. They cannot interfere in criminal or civil suits. Back to you.
And many thanks for that update. CNA's Deborah Wong reporting live from Hong Kong. Now, the U.S. intelligence community is striking a measured tone in a new report saying that China is not currently planning to invade Taiwan next year. The report says Beijing is seeking to control the island without the use of force. And that's despite China's threats to use force if necessary. The report added that Chinese leaders do not have a fixed timeline for achieving reunification with the island. Beijing has responded saying that resolving the Taiwan question is a matter for China only, and also called on Washington to correct its understanding of Beijing instead of hyping up the, quote, China threat. Now, the intelligence agency's annual threat assessment report comes as Beijing upped the ante against Taiwan, carrying out frequent military drills near the island with aircraft and vessels. Taipei says it will continue to monitor Chinese activities in the region. And the report also found that North Korea poses, quote, significant threats to the U.S., South Korea and Japan as it pushed ahead with developing its nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities. The assessment pointing out a series of North Korean threat elements, among other security challenges, including what's been described as Pyongyang's sophisticated and agile cyber program. The report, however, stated that the North is likely to remain deterred by the U.S. and allied forces, despite the benefits received from Russia in return for its support in the war against Ukraine. Well, the U.S. and South Korea have wrapped up their annual springtime drills aimed at strengthening combined readiness posture and military cooperation across all domains. The Freedom Shield exercise took place amid North Korea's verbal threats and missile launches. Though the U.S. says the drills demonstrated the strength of its alliance with South Korea, as well as the ability of the two countries to operate seamlessly as one force. Seoul says this year's exercise has reaffirmed the value of peace and stability within the region and raised the combined defense posture and operational capabilities to the next level. The Freedom Shield exercise took place over an 11-day run that involved realistic wartime scenarios. Some 18,000 troops took part in the drills. And before we go, Finland has been named the happiest country in the world for a record 9th time in a row. It topped the annual World Happiness Report that ranks more than 140 nations based on how people evaluate their own lives. Researchers also analyzed factors such as social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom, generosity, and perceptions of corruption. Well, clearly, the Nordic countries have the secret sauce. Check this out. Finland's fellow Nordic nations, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are all right there in the top 10 with Finland. Costa Rica is one of the standout performers this year, rising to number 4, its highest ever ranking after entering the top 10 for the first time last year. Now, it is a bit of a reality check for us here in the Lion City, though. Singapore slipped 2 spots to 36 this year, but it remains one of the happiest countries in Asia, ranking above Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, Japan, and China. And on that note, we wrap up East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia, and look us up on all our socials, Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.